History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 5 The Making of the European Age. Chapter 5 World History's New Shape. In 1776, there began in America the first of a series of colonial revolts, which were to take several decades to work themselves out. Besides marking an epoch in the history of the American continents, these upheavals provide a convenient vantage ground from which to consider the first phase of European hegemony as a whole. In other parts of the world, too, something of a change of rhythm was marked by such facts as the elimination of serious French competition to the British in India and the opening of Australia's the last discovered and habitable continent to settle. At the end of the 18th century, there is a sense of completing one era and opening an era. It is a good point for assessment of the difference made by the previous 3 centuries to the history of the globe. During them, outright conquest and occupation were the main form of European hegemony. They provided wealth Europe could use to increase still further its relative superiority over other civilizations, and they set up political structures which diffuse other forms of European influence. They were the work of a handful of European states, which were the first world powers in the geographical range of their interests, even if not in their strength. The Atlantic nations, to which the age of discoveries had given opportunities and historical destinies distinct from those of European states. The first to seize these opportunities had been Spain and Portugal, the only great colonial powers of the 16th century. They had long passed their zenith by 1763, when the Peace of Paris, which ended the Seven Years' War, was signed. This treaty is a convenient marker of a new world order which had already replaced that dominated by Spain and Portugal. It registered the ascendancy of Great Britain in the rivalry with France overseas, which had preoccupied her for nearly 3 quarters of a century. The duel was not over, and Frenchmen could still be hopeful that they would recover lost ground. Great Britain, nonetheless, was the great imperial power of the future. The two nations had eclipsed the Dutch, whose empire had been built like theirs in the 7th century, in the era of declining Portuguese and Spain power. But Spain and Portugal and the United Provinces all still held important colonial territories and had left enduring marks on the world map. These 5 nations had by the 18th century been differentiated by their oceanic history, both from the landlocked states of Central Europe and from those of the Mediterranean, so important in earlier centuries. Their special colonial and overseas trade interests had given their diplomats new causes and places over which to compete. Most other states had been slower to recognize how important issues outside Europe might be, and so indeed had even some of these 5 at times. Spain had fought grimly enough, first for the Habsburgs in Italy, then against the Ottomans, and finally for European supremacy in the 30 Years' War, to waste the treasure of the Indies in the process. In their long duel with the British, the French were always more liable than their rivals to distraction and the diversion of their resources to continental ends. At the outset, the discernment that extra European issues might be intrinsically tangled with European interests in diplomacy had, after all, barely existed. Once the Spanish and Portuguese had demarcated their interests to their own satisfaction, there was little to concern other European nations. The fate of a French Huguenot settlement in Florida or the flouting of the vague Spanish claims which was implicit in the Roanoke voyages hardly troubled the minds of European diplomats. let alone shaped their negotiations. This situation began to change when English pirates had adventurers, countenanced by Elizabeth I, began to inflict real damage on the Spanish fleets and colonies. They were soon joined by the Dutch, and from this time, one of the great themes of the diplomacy of the next century was apparent. As a French minister wrote under Louis XIV, trade is the cause of a perpetual combat in war and in peace between the nations of Europe. So much had time changed in 200 years. Rulers had, of course, always been concerned with wealth and the opportunity of increasing it. Venice had long defended her commerce by diplomatic means, and the English had often safeguarded their cloth exports to Flanders by treaty. It was widely accepted that there was only so much profit to go around, and that one country could therefore only gain at the expense of others. But it was a long time before diplomacy had to take account of the pursuit of wealth outside Europe. There was even an attempt to segregate such matters. In 1559, the French and Spanish agreed that what their captains did to one another beyond the line, which meant at that time west of the Azores and south of the Tropic of Cancer, should not be taken as a reason for hostility between the two states in Europe. The change to a new set of diplomatic assumptions, if that is the way to put it, began in conflicts over trade with the Spanish Empire. Contemporary thinking took it for granted that in the colonial relationship, the interests of the metropolitan power were always paramount. In so far as those interests were economic, settlement colonies were intended to produce either by exploiting their mineral and natural resources or by their balance of trade with the mother country, a net advantage to the latter and, if possible, self sufficiency, while her trading bases gave her the domination of certain areas of international traffic. By 1600, it was clear that the claims would be settled by sea power, and since the defeat of the Armada, Spanish sea power no longer commanded the respect it had done. Essentially, Philip was caught in a dilemma: the dispersal of his effort and interest between Europe, where the struggle with the Valois and Elizabeth, the Dutch revolt, and the Counter Reformation all claimed his resources, and the Indies, where safety could have lain only in the sea power and the organization of effective Spanish supply of the colonists' needs. The choice was to try to keep the empire but to use it to pay for European policies. This was to underrate the difficulties of controlling so huge an empire through 16th century bureaucracy and communications. Nevertheless, a huge and complicated system of regular sailings in convoy, the concentration of colonial trade in a few authorized ports, and policing by Coast Guard squadrons were always in which the Spanish tried to keep the wealth of the Indies to themselves. It was the Dutch who first made it clear that they were prepared to fight for a share of such prizes and therefore first forced diplomats to turn their attention and skills to regulating matters outside Europe. For the Dutch, predominance in trade overrode their considerations. What they would do for it was made clear from the start of the 17th century in the East Indies, the Caribbean, and Brazil, where they engaged great fleets against the Spanish Portuguese defense of world's chief producer of sugar. The last provided their only serious failure, for in 1654 the Portuguese were able to evict the Dutch garrisons and resume control without subsequent challenge. This quest for commercial wealth cut across the wishes of the most Protestant of English 17th century governments. England had been an ally of the Dutch rebels in the previous century, and Cromwell would have liked nothing better than the leadership of a Protestant alliance against Catholic Spain. Instead, he found himself fighting the first of three Anglo Dutch wars. The first, 1652 to 1654, was essentially a trade war. What was at issue was the English decision to restrict imports to England to goods traveling in English ships or those of the country producing the goods. This was a deliberate attempt to encourage English shipping and put it in a position to catch up with the Dutch. It struck at the heart of Dutch prosperity, its European carrying trade, and, in particular, that in Baltic goods. The Commonwealth had a good navy and won. The second round came in 1665 after the Dutch had been further provoked by the English seizure of New Amsterdam. In this war, the Dutch had the French and Danes as allies and also had the best of it at sea. At the peace, they were therefore able to win an easing of the English restrictions on imports, although they left New Amsterdam to the English in exchange for an offshoot of Barbados at Suriname. This was decided by the Treaty of Breda, 1667, the first multilateral European peace settlement to say as much about the regulation of extra European affairs as European. By it, France surrendered West Indian islands to England and received in return recognition of her possession of the uninhabited and uninviting but strategically important territory of Acadia. The English had done well. The new Caribbean acquisitions followed in a tradition established under the Commonwealth when Jamaica had been taken from Spain. It was England's first transoceanic acquisition of territory by conquest. Cromwell's policies have been seen as a decisive turn towards conscious imperial policy. This may be attributing too much to his vision. The returned Stuarts indeed kept intact most of the navigation system for the protection of shipping and colonial trade, as well as hanging on to Jamaica and continuing to recognize the new importance of the West Indies. Charles II gave a character Charles II gave a charter to a new company named after Hudson Bay to contest with the French the fur trade of the North and West. He and his, in other ways, inadequate successor, James II, at least maintained, even if with some setbacks, English naval strength so that it was available to William of Orange in his wars with Louis XIV. It would be tedious to trace the details changes of the next century during which the new imperial emphasis, first of English and then of British diplomacy, came to maturity. A brief third Anglo Dutch war, it had virtually no important consequences, does not really belong to this epoch, which is dominated by the long rivalry of England and France. The War of the League of Augsburg, or King William's War, as it was called in America, brought much colonial fighting but no great changes. The War of the Spanish Succession was very different. It was a world war, the first of modern era, about the fate of the Spanish Empire as well as about French power. At its close, British not only won Acadia, henceforth Nova Scotia, and other acquisitions in the Western Hemisphere from the French, but also the right to supply slaves to the Spanish colonies and to send one ship a year with merchandise to trade with them. Overseas matters loomed larger and larger in British foreign policy after this. European considerations mattered less in spite of the change of dynasty in 1714, when the Elector of Hanover became the first king of Great Britain. Though there were some embarrassing moments, British policy remained remarkably consistent, always swinging back to the goals of promoting, sustaining, and extending British commerce. Often this was done by seeking to maintain a general peace, sometimes by diplomatic pressure, as when the Habsburgs were persuaded to withdraw a scheme for an Ostend company to trade with Asia, sometimes by fighting to maintain privileges or strategical advantage. The importance of war became clearer and clearer. The first time that two European powers ever went to war on a purely non European issue came in 1739, when the British government began hostilities with Spain over, in essence, the Spanish right of search in the Caribbean, or as the Spanish might have put it, over the steps they properly took to secure their empire against abuse of the trading privileges granted in 1713. This was to be remembered as the War of Jenkins' Ear, the organ produced in Pickle by its owner in the House of Commons, whose sensitive patriotism was inflamed and outraged to hear of the alleged mutilation by a Spanish coast guard. The conflict soon became caught up with the War of the Austrian Succession and therefore became an Anglo French struggle. The peace of 1748 did not much change the respective territorial position of the two rivals, nor did it end fighting in North America, where the French appeared to be about to cut off the British settlements forever from the American West by a chain of forts. The British government sent regular contingents to America for the first time in order to meet this danger, but they were unsuccessful. Only in the Seven Years' War did a British minister grasp that the chance of a final decision in the long duel existed because of France's commitment to her ally Austria in Europe. Once British resources were allocated accordingly, sweeping victories in North America and India were followed by others in the Caribbean, some at the expense of Spain. A British force even seized Philippines. It was global war. The peace of 1763 did not, in fact, go so far in crippling France and Spain as many Englishmen had wanted, but it virtually eliminated French competition in North America and India. When it was a question of retaining Canada or Guadeloupe, a sugar producing island, one consideration in favor of keeping Canada was the competition from increased sugar production within the empire was feared by Caribbean planters already under the British flag. The result was a huge new British Empire. By 1763, the whole of eastern North America and the Gulf Coast as far west as the mouth of the Mississippi was British. The elimination of French Canada had blown away the threat, or from the French point of view, the hope of a French empire of the Mississippi Valley stretching from the St. Lawrence to New Orleans, which had been created by the great French explorers of the 17th century. Off the continental coast, the Bahamas were the northern link of an island chain that ran down through the Lesser Antilles to Tobago and all but enclosed the Caribbean. Within it, Jamaica, Honduras, and the Belize coast were British. In the Peace of 1713, the British had exacted a limited legal right to trade in slaves with the Spanish Empire, which they quickly pressed far beyond its intended limits. In Africa, there were only a few British posts on the Gold Coast, but these were the basis of huge African slave trade. In Asia, the direct government of Bengal was about to provide a start to the territorial phase of British expansion in India. British imperial supremacy was based on sea power. Its ultimate origins could be sought in the ships built by Henry VIII, among the greatest warships of the age. But this early start was not followed up until the reign of Elizabeth I. Her captains, with little financing available, either from crown or commercial investors, built both a fighting tradition and better ships from the profits of operations against the Spanish. Again, there was an ebbing of interest and effort under the early Stuart kings. The royal administration could not afford ships. It was only under the Commonwealth, ironically, that the serious and continuing interest in naval power which sustained the Royal Navy of the future began. By that time, the connection between Dutch superiority in merchant shipping and their naval strength had been taken to heart, and the upshot was the Navigation Act, which provoked the First Anglo Dutch War. A strong merchant marine provided a nursery of seamen for fighting vessels and the flow of trade, whose taxation by customs dues would finance the upkeeping of specialized warships. A strong merchant marine could only be built upon carrying the goods of other nations. Hence, the importance of competing, if necessary, by gunfire and of breaking into such reserved areas as the Spanish American trade. The machines which were evolved to do the fighting in this competition underwent steady improvement and specialization, but no revolutionary change between the 15th and 19th centuries. Once square rigging and broadside firing had been adopted, the essential shape of the vessels was determined through individual design, could still do much to give sailing superiority, and the French usually built better ships than Great Britain during the 18th century duel between the two countries. In the 16th century, under English influence, ships grew longer in proportion to their beam. The relative height of the forecastle and pop above the deck gradually came down too over the whole period. Bronze guns reached a high level of development even in early 17th century. Thereafter, gunnery changed by improvement in design, accuracy and weight of shot. There were two significant 18th century innovations: the short range but large caliber and heavy shotted iron carronade, which greatly increased the power of even small vessels, and a firing mechanism incorporating a flintlock, which made possible more precise control of the guns. Specialization of function and design between warships and merchant vessels was accepted by the middle of the 17th century, though the line was still somewhat blurred by the existence of older vessels and the practice of privateering. This was a way of obtaining naval power on the cheap. In time of war, governments authorized individual private captains or their employers to prey upon enemy shipping, taking profits from the prizes they made. It was a form of regularized piracy, and English, Dutch, and French privateers all operated at various times with great success against one another's traders. The first great privateering war was that fought unsuccessfully against the English and Dutch under King William by the French. Other 17th century innovations were tactical and administrative. Signaling became formalized, and the first fighting instructions were issued to the Royal Navy. Recruitment became more important. The press gang appeared in England. The French used naval conscription in the maritime provinces. In this way, large fleets were manned, and it became clear that given equality of skill and the limited damage which could be done even by heavy guns, numbers were always likely to be decisive in the end. From the seminal period of development in the 17th century, there emerged a naval supremacy which was to last over 2 centuries and underpin a worldwide Pax Britannica. Dutch competition dropped away as the Republic bent under the strain of defending its independence on land against the French. The important maritime rival of the English was France, and here it is possible to see that a decisive point had been passed by the end of King William's reign. By then, The dilemma of being great on land or sea had been decided by the French in favor of the land. From that time, the promise of a French naval supremacy was never to be revived, though French shipbuilders and captains would still win victories by their skill and courage. The English were not so distracted from oceanic power. They had only to keep their continental allies in the field, not to keep up great armies themselves. But there was a little more to it than a simple concentration of resources. British maritime strategy also evolved in a way very different from that of other sea powers. Here, the French loss of interest in the navy of Louis XIV is relevant, for it came after the English had inflicted a resounding defeat in a fleet action in 1692 which discredited the French admirals. It was the first of many such victories which demonstrated an appreciation of the strategic reality that sea power was in the end a matter of commanding the surface of the sea so that friendly ships could move on it in safety while those of enemy could not. The key to this desirable end was the neutralization of the enemy's fleet. So long as it was there, a danger existed. The early defeat of the enemy's fleet in battle, therefore, became the supreme aim of British naval commanders for a century, during which it gave the Royal Navy almost uninterrupted command of the seas and a formidable offensive tradition. Naval strategy fed imperial enterprise indirectly as well as directly because it made more and more necessary the acquisition of bases from which squadrons could operate. This was particularly important in building the British Empire. In the late 18th century, too, that empire was about to undergo the loss of much of its settled territory, and this would bring further into relief the way in which European hegemony was outside the New World, still in 1800, a matter of trading station, island plantations, and bases, and the control of carrying trade rather than of occupation of larger areas. Less than 3 centuries of even this limited form of imperialism revolutionized the world economy. Before 1500, there had been hundreds of more or less self supporting and self contained economies, some of them linked by trade. The Americas and Africa were almost Australasia was entirely unknown to Europe. Communication within them was tiny in proportion to their huge extent, and there was a thin flow of luxury trade from Asia to Europe. By 1800, a worldwide network of exchange had appeared. Even Japan was a part of it, and Central Africa, though still mysterious and unknown, was linked to it through slavery and the Arabs. Its first two striking adumbrations had been the diversion of Asian trade with Europe to the sea routes dominated by the Portuguese, and the flow of bullion from America to Europe. Without that stream, above all of silver, there could hardly have been a trade with Asia, for there was almost nothing produced in Europe that Asia wanted. This may have been the main importance of the bullion from the Americas, whose flow reached its peak at the end of the 16th century and in the early decades of the next. Although a new abundance of precious metals was the first and most dramatically obvious economic effect of Europe's new interplay with Asia and America. It was less important than the general growth of trade, of which slaves from Africa for the Caribbean and Brazil formed a part. The slave ships usually made their voyage back to Europe from the Americas loaded with the colonial produce, which more and more became a necessity to Europe. In Europe, first Amsterdam and then London surpassed Antwerp, as international ports in large measure because of the huge growth of re export trade in colonial goods, which were carried by Dutch and English ships. Around these central flows of trade, there proliferated branches and sub branches which led to further specializations and ramifications. Shipbuilding, textiles, and later financial services such as insurance all prospered together, sharing in the consequence of a huge expansion in sheer volume. Eastern trade in the second half of the 18th century made up a quarter of the whole of Dutch external commerce, and during that century, the number of ships sent out by East India Company from London went up threefold. These ships, moreover, improved in design, carried more, and were worked by fewer men than those of earlier times.